Of all the Chaos gods, arguably the greatest amongst them is Khorne, the god of violence, hatred, and murder. In addition to being a god of bloodshed, Khorne is also seen by some as being a god of martial pride and honour, whose followers will range from honourable and noble warriors to brutish and frenzied berserkers. While the devotees of the other ruinous powers may erect temples dedicated to their glory, those who follow Khorne are less likely to raise such places of worship in the blood god's name. The followers of Khorne almost without exception believe that the one true temple to Khorne is the battlefield, and that the time used to build temples in honour of the blood god should instead be utilised to spill blood and take skulls in his name. Indeed, those followers of the blood god who allow a day to pass without committing bloodshed in his name are said to draw the wrathful eye of Khorne himself upon them. Above all other things, Khorne is quite simply the personification of mindless slaughter, destruction, and butchery. Whether or not the blood spilled in his honour comes from his own followers, or from those killed in his name, is of little consequence, as Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it does. The war cry of those devoted to Khorne reflects the god's own desire for gratuitous bloodshed, and brings terror to the hearts of all who hear it. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Being almost exclusively savage and violent warriors, though there are some rare exceptions, the followers of Khorne typically do not make use of psychic powers or sorcery. This is due to the fact that the blood god is said to view magic as the tool of those weaklings and cowards who are unable to best a foe in mortal combat using only their martial prowess or sheer brute strength. And yet, despite the blood god's disdain of sorcery, there have been a few documented examples of Psykers who either pledged their allegiance to Khorne, or, even more bizarrely, what can only be described as Khornate Psykers, as well as incidents detailing when Khorne's demonic minions made use of Psykers for their own ends. The first example of these peculiar instances is with the organisation known as the Blood Pact. The Blood Pact was a chaos cult devoted to Khorne, as well as being trained and equipped to similar standards seen within the regiments of the Astra Militarum. Unlike most Khornate cults, which are comprised of little more than frothing berserkers that resort to charging their enemy in order to brutally tear them apart in a frenzied display of gore, the Blood Pact was highly disciplined by comparison, showing a degree of restraint that is almost unheard of within the worshippers of the blood god. The cult's warriors would regularly engage the enemy from a distance, using weaponry such as las or autoguns, though they were not above using melee weapons such as flaying knives to spill blood in Khorne's name. In addition to their discipline, training, high-quality weaponry and vehicular support, the Blood Pact also boasted a specialist group of Psykers known as Gore Mages. These Gore Mages used their abilities to channel demonic entities into the bodies of Blood Pact cultists, transforming them into ferocious and almost unstoppable creatures known simply as Blood Wolves. These Blood Wolves were extremely powerful creations, capable of distorting reality around them, as well as move at speeds too fast for the human eye to follow. They also displayed incredible strength and dexterity, able to decapitate multiple enemies with ease, and even being able to use their immense bulk and speed to effectively bulldoze their way through the enemy, causing them to explode in a shower of gore just from the sheer brute force of their charge. However, the process causes immense strain upon the mortal host's body, and as a result, Blood Wolves have a life expectancy of only a few minutes before their host becomes little more than a charred husk of burnt meat. In addition to this, the Gore Mages also radiated an aura that instills extreme and almost irrational sensations of fear to those exposed to it, which was even experienced by other members of the cult, as well as making use of additional abilities, including psychic screams, divination, and warp lightning. One example of these abilities being demonstrated was detailed within the novel Blood Pact with Lady Ulrike, who was the sole Gore mage within a Blood Pact task force under the command of her brother Balthazar Isle upon the world of Balhort.
The blood scream knocked them all flat and blew out the huge skylights of the honorarium. Howling, the witch came for them, surrounded by a coruscating ball of warp lightning. She was demented and raving. She was screaming vengeance for the death of her beloved brother. She came at them across the floor of the honorarium like a typhoon, driving an Arctic blizzard before her. Dry lightning tore the air. All Westmag saw was the old dame who had haunted his mind since Hinterhouse. All Westmags wanted was to be free of her phantom torment. He opened fire, screaming on full auto, and discharged the laser rifle's entire energy reservoir. His shots exploded the witch's cocoon of warp energy and shredded her. She took nearly 200 hits, and by the time her body struck the paving stones, it was pulped beyond any semblance of articulacy.
An example of a Psyker falling to the worship of Khorne comes from Azariah Kyras, the former chapter master and chief librarian of the Bloodraven Space Marine chapter. Azariah's fall to chaotic corruption would eventually begin due to his encounter with Ulker, a greater demon of Nurgle, upon the world of Aurelia, when he fought the demon to avenge his fallen master Moria. Azariah was presumed dead when the world was pushed out of its orbit by a warp storm, turning it into a frozen wasteland, and eventually vanishing into the depths of the warp. However, Azariah had somehow survived, and through unknown means had made his way to the space hulk known as the Judgment of Carrion, though it is implied that the Bloodraven's survival was due to a pact formed with the aforementioned Ulker. Ultimately, Azariah would eventually fall to the worship of Khorne, and Azariah's chaotic corruption would eventually lead to a chapter civil war, where those who remained loyal to the Imperium would battle fiercely against those loyal to their now heretical chapter master. Azariah would make his devotion to Khorne evident during the events of the Second Aurelian Crusade, when the heretic Astartes of the Black Legion made their presence known within the Aurelian subsector.
Faithful, enlightened, ambitious brethren, in but a single decade, a few mere swipes of the pendulum, we have gathered a sacrifice to Khorne that will be made legend. Though it was a simpler, weaker voice that illuminated me during my centuries upon the judgment of Carrion. It was Khorne's messenger that showed me the true path of freedom from our pathetic corpse emperor. And what is this path? This meaning? This purpose to which we gather the skulls of our foes? It is nothing. There is no meaning, no purpose. We murder, we kill. It is mindless savagery. This universe is mindless! In mere hours, millions will die. Innocent, guilty, strong and weak, honest and deceitful, all of them! They will scream, they will burn, and for no purpose but the mighty Khorne may revel in their bloodshed. And united in this void of purpose, fear or duty, we shall at long last be free! Blood for the blood god! Skulls for the skull throne! Let the galaxy burn!
Azariah Kyras had clearly pleased the Blood God, as he would be rewarded with the promise of apotheosis, beginning his transformation into a demon prince of Khorne. His ritual of ascension, however, would be interrupted and stopped due to the interference of loyalist Bloodraven forces under the command of 3rd Captain Gabriel Angelos. Though Azariah fought with savage brutality, even managing to inflict grievous wounds upon the loyalist interloper, he would ultimately be slain by Angelos, who would succeed Azariah as Chapter Master. Khorne's demonic minions have also been shown to manipulate Psykers for their own ends. A prominent example of this was detailed within the story Sons of Wrath, with the Flesh Terror's librarian, Nuriel. Nuriel would be subjected to a series of visions where a warrior clad in blood-red armour and wielding a black sword would state that the only path for salvation for the Flesh Terror's chapter would be through bloodshed and strife, and that enemies surround and plot against the librarian at every turn. These visions would begin to have an effect on Nuriel, who would become more and more aggressive and bloodthirsty. The demon feeding these visions to Nuriel would take advantage of the librarian's own anger, ego, and ambition to fuel the flames of treachery. Eventually, Nuriel would suffer a final vision of the warrior in blood, who then stated the following to the librarian when the Flesh Terrors were in the midst of a battle against the Eagle Warriors chapter upon the world of Zircon Primus.
Our father in blood sent me to follow you. You alone have the strength to do what must be done. The will to see the blood honored. Where you lead, I follow. My strength is yours to wield. You need but take it. Take it. Remove my head. Claim my skull.
Nuriel would then become possessed by a bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne, who would speak in both its own voice as well as Nuriel's in order to taunt Chapter Master Nasir Amit as the two battled against one another. The Bloodthirster would also make use of Nuriel's Force Sword and psychic powers within their duel, demonstrating this by hurling the Flesh Terror's Chapter Master back several feet as it unleashed a blast of kinetic force. Eventually though, the Bloodthirster would be banished back into the warp, and Nuriel would cease to exist. These three examples have shown that Khorne is not fully against utilizing those with psychic talents for his own ends. So why exactly could Khorne, the god of battle who is said to despise all forms of magic, tolerate the use of such powers from individuals or cults dedicated to him? In the case of the Gore Mages of the Blood Pact, it's feasible to assume that Khorne would accept these mages utilizing their own psychic abilities for one particular reason. The Gore Mages predominantly used their powers to bind demonic entities into a mortal body, which in turn allowed the Blood God's minions to slay all in their path, spilling blood and taking skulls in their master's name. Such use of powers is not the subtle or cowardly acts displayed by other sorcerers who kill from a distance, or simply manipulate others to do their bidding. For the Gore Mages did not hide behind others whilst using their magics. They simply utilize their powers to create what can effectively be described as demon hosts. In regards to Khornate Psykers, such as Azariah Kyras, it needs to be pointed out that librarians and sorcerers are not the same. Sorcerers make use of arcane knowledge such as magical incantations, runes, as well as other tricks and trinkets in order to harness the powers of the warp. This in itself is a method that is employed by the rune priests of the Space Wolves chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. The chapter's rune priests remain firm in their belief that their psychic abilities are not derived through simply tapping into the energies of the warp, but instead believe their powers are granted to them by the grace of the animalistic spirits that exist upon their homeworld of Fenris, which is then channeled through various totems and runes inscribed upon their armour. It's also worth noting that shamanism in itself can be described as a discipline of magic and sorcery, despite the Space Wolves' own hypocritical claims to the contrary. Psykers, on the other hand, will use their own natural abilities to harness the energies of the warp, as opposed to magical incantations or through making pacts with demonic entities, though some Psykers will recite specific mantras to aid in their concentration when using their powers. It would be logical to assume that Khorne would find one's sheer force of will and natural ability of tapping into the warp an acceptable way to spill blood, even if it is not his preferred method of bloodshed, due to these powers being one's own natural abilities, as opposed to being derived from arcane sorceries and spells. In this way, using one's own natural warp harnessing talents would be no different than an animal using its teeth and claws to make a kill. Nonetheless, one must never forget that regardless of the methods used to accomplish it, Khorne only desires that blood continues to be spilled in his name. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.